Maybe you are lying there, feeling the heavy, damp texture of your own emotions, and you find yourself wishing they were something else. Perhaps you feel as though you are made of raw, sticky clay that refuses to hold a shape, while everyone else you know seems to have already been fired in a kiln and hardened into something polished, functional, and perfectly still. You might be exhausted from the constant secret work of trying to smooth over your own edges. It is a lonely kind of labor to constantly hide the parts of yourself that feel wet or shifting or unformed, fearing that if anyone saw you in this state, they would see a failed vessel. The room is quiet, and the light from the window is a faint silver smudge against the dark, but inside your chest, there is still that restless, turning motion of trying to fix who you are. You are not a broken thing that needs to be discarded. You are not a mistake of nature, because you feel things deeply, or because you struggle to keep a consistent, hardened shape. What you are experiencing right now is not a failure of character. It is simply the human experience of being soft in a world that often rewards the hard. Tonight, we are not going to force your mind into a mold. We are not going to try to fire the kiln, to harden your heart into something invulnerable. Instead, we are going to learn how to be with the clay as it is, wet and messy and capable of changing. You are safe here, in this quiet, to stop pressing yourself into a shape you were never meant to keep. The mind often believes that peace is found in becoming a finished product. We think that if we could just handle our anger, our fear, or our confusion with enough discipline, we would finally stop feeling like we are falling apart. We believe that a wise person is one who has been hardened by experience. Someone who no longer wobbles. Someone who no longer retains the fingerprints of their own struggle. But this is the paradox that keeps us awake. The more we try to force ourselves into a permanent, perfect shape, the more we brittle and crack. Peace is not found in becoming a hardened, static object that nothing can touch. Peace is found in the willingness to remain soft enough to receive the experience of life as it unfolds. You do not need to be a finished vase to be worthy of rest. You only need to be the earth, grounded and present, waiting for the water to settle. Take a moment now to notice the weight of your own body. Feel where you are touching the surface of the bed. You do not have to hold yourself up. You do not have to keep your form rigid to prove you are here. Let your muscles go. Let your skin settle, and let the breath move through you, as if you were just a hollow space, open and waiting. You have been carrying the weight of all those unfinished shapes all day long, the projects you didn't start, the versions of yourself you felt you had to perform, the apologies you didn't give, and the fears you didn't name. You can let all of that rest here beside you, like tools placed on the floor after a long day in the workshop. You might notice that your mind wants to keep checking on those shapes. It wants to go back and examine them to see if they are still there, to see if they are still broken. But notice how much energy that requires. It takes a constant, silent tension in your shoulders to keep looking back at the past. It takes a subtle holding in your jaw to prepare for the future. What would happen if you gave yourself permission to stop looking for a moment? What would happen if you allowed yourself to be just this, a human being resting in the dark, without any need to be anything other than what is right here? You are not required to be a polished, glazed vessel tonight. You are allowed to be the lump of wet, cool earth. There is a deep, ancient wisdom in the soil. It does not try to be a cup. It does not try to be a bowl. It simply is, holding the potential for everything, but demanding nothing of itself. When you allow yourself to sink into this level of being, you are returning to the truth of your own nature. You are returning to the place where all the striving ends. It is not a place of defeat. It is a place of fundamental, quiet power. When a potter works with clay, they do not start with a plan that is set in stone. They start with the feel of the material. They learn what it needs by touching it. They don't punish the clay if it leans to one side. They don't judge it if it is a little too wet. They simply recenter it. They apply a gentle, steady pressure, and the form returns to the middle. You have been punishing yourself for leaning, for wobbling, for being too wet with your own tears, or too dry with your own defenses. You have been judging the very material of your life. But tonight, we will practice a different way of touching your own heart. We will learn how to be the gentle hand that finds the center, not through force, but through a slow, patient awareness. You have been working so hard to make yourself into something that can withstand the heat. But tonight, there is no heat. There is no kiln. There is only the cool dark and the stillness of the room and the soft, rhythmic cycle of your own breathing. You are not being tested. You are not being assessed. You are simply being held by the night. If you find that your mind is still circling around, trying to find a project to fix, try to notice that as you would notice a small, insignificant movement in the corner of your eye. To taste it. You do not have to capture it. Just let it be and turn your attention back to the breath, which is the steady, quiet turning of the wheel. The wheel keeps turning, whether you are worried or not. The breath keeps moving, whether you have solved your problems or not. You are already in the flow of your own life. You do not need to push the wheel. You only need to let it carry you. There is a great comfort in realizing that you are allowed to be unfinished. A vessel that is already fired cannot change. It cannot grow. It cannot hold anything new because it has already reached its final, rigid conclusion. But a lump of clay is full of possibilities. It is always ready to become something else, something deeper, something more honest. Your vulnerability is not your weakness. It is the very thing that makes you capable of growth. It is the signature of your living, breathing reality. Tonight, we will walk through the valley of the workshop together. We will look at the tools we have used to build our defenses, and we will see them for what they are. We will not discard them with anger. We will set them down with understanding. And as we do, we will find that the exhaustion we have been carrying was not caused by the weight of the work, but by the weight of our own resistance. We were holding the clay as if it were a weapon instead of a gift. In a few moments, we will enter the story of an apprentice who thought that a perfect pot was the goal of a lifetime and who had to learn the hard way that the mark of the hand is the most beautiful thing about the work. But for now, you don't need to look for any moral or any lesson. You only need to follow the sound of the words and the rhythm of your own softening body as the evening settles into the deepest part of the quiet. You are here. You are safe. You are exactly where you are meant to be, not because you have earned it, but because you are alive, and the night has room for you. Is there a part of your day that you are still trying to scrub clean, as if you could wash away the events that have already happened? Perhaps you are rubbing at a memory until it is raw. What would happen if you simply stopped the scrubbing and let the image sit just as it is, wet and unpolished? Right there in the dark. You don't have to change it. You don't have to defend it. You only have to watch it with the gentle eyes of someone who knows that even the messiest parts of life are part of the landscape, and as you let it be, feel the tension in your hands begin to unclench. Feel the way your heart, which has been protecting itself from the memory, finally begins to beat with a little more space. In a valley hidden deep, beneath a crown of jagged peaks, there existed a small rustic workshop dedicated to the craft of the kiln, a highland. It was not a place of grand art or famous treasures. It was a place where the earth was brought in from the riverbanks, cleaned of its stones, and transformed into vessels meant for the humble tasks of drinking water and storing grain. The keeper of this workshop was a man named Koi. He was known for hands that were perpetually coated in a fine, grey dust, and for a silence that seemed to hold as much weight as the vessels he shaped. Koi did not speak much about the philosophy of his craft. He simply worked from the moment the sun touched the rim of the valley until the evening mist turned the surrounding pines into dark, blurred shapes. One autumn, a young apprentice arrived at Koji's gate. The youth was eager, bright-eyed, and convinced that he possessed an inherent talent for creating perfection. He believed that a true artisan was defined by the flawlessness of his output. He spent his days at the potter's wheel with a focused, desperate intensity. He measured his progress by how smooth his surfaces were and how perfectly symmetrical his rims appeared. Whenever he finished a piece, he would hold it up to the light, scanning for the slightest unevenness. If he found even a tiny imperfection, a smudge of a fingerprint, or a slight wobble in the curve, he would instantly crush the wet clay back into a lump and begin again. He did this over and over, his movements becoming increasingly rigid and hurried. Koi would watch from his corner of the workshop, his own hands moving with a slow, rhythmic grace as he worked. On his own pieces, he never offered advice. He never corrected the apprentice's technique. He simply continued to pull the earth upward into form, his breath perfectly synced with the turning of the wheel. The apprentice, however, grew more frustrated with each passing day. He felt that Koji's silent observation was a critique of his lack of speed, or perhaps his inability to produce a masterpiece. He worked deeper into the nights, the glow of the kiln fire casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of the workshop, hoping that if he could just craft one perfect pot, he would finally earn the approval he craved. One evening, the apprentice produced a bowl that he felt was truly superior to all his previous attempts. It was thin, elegant, and possessed a uniform curve that made it look almost like it had been carved from wood rather than molded from mud. He set it on the drying rack with a sense of triumph. He felt a rare moment of pride, thinking that he had finally conquered the temperamental nature of the clay. But as he turned to reach for his water bucket, his sleeve brushed the edge of the rack. The bowl tipped, teetered for a heartbeat on the wooden ledge, and then fell, striking the stone floor with a sharp, sickening sound. It shattered into 4 distinct pieces. The apprentice collapsed to his knees, his face pale with sudden, sharp grief. It felt as if he had shattered along with the bowl. He stared at the jagged shards, tears stinging his eyes, and he began to scramble, to pick them up, desperate to see if he could press them back together. He felt the cold, hard edges of the broken clay against his palms. To him, the broken bowl was a complete invalidation of his worth. It was proof that his efforts were wasted and that the messiness of his labor was a stain upon his soul. He sat there in the quiet of the workshop, the smell of damp earth and wood smoke filling the air, utterly convinced that he was a failure who had no place among the skilled artisans of the world. Koi stood up from his bench. He walked over with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had walked that same stone floor. For 40 years, he knelt beside the young man. He did not offer words of comfort. He did not tell him that it was only a bowl, or that accidents are a part of life. He simply reached out and picked up one of the shards. He turned it over in his calloused fingers, examining the texture of the clay where it had snapped. And then he looked at the apprentice. He pointed to the lump of raw, grey clay that sat in the corner of the room, still moist and cool, waiting to be shaped. Koi moved with the slow, steady grace of the earth itself. He reached for a small wooden tool he used to score the surface of his vessels, a simple stick of polished bamboo that had been smoothed by decades of contact with his palm. He held it out to the apprentice. He did not gesture for him to pick up the broken pieces. He gestured toward the raw, wet lump in the corner. He waited, his eyes reflecting the soft, dim light of the dying kiln fire. The apprentice looked at the shard in Koji's hand, then at the wooden tool, then at the raw earth. For the first time, he did not see the clay as a medium for his own perfection. He saw it as a living, shifting thing that existed independently of his need for control. It was a small, almost imperceptible moment. But in that silence, the air in the workshop seemed to change. The tension that had defined the apprentice's movements began to dissipate, replaced by the heavy, grounding stillness of the valley night. Koi set the shard down on the floor, not as trash, but as a part of the workshop, and then he returned to his bench. He picked up his own mound of clay. He did not rush to start a new vessel. He simply pressed his thumbs into the center, feeling the resistance, feeling the life within the material. He was inviting the apprentice to observe, not to imitate. The apprentice remained on the floor for a long time. He felt the cold dampness of the stone creeping through his robes, but he did not move to stand. He watched. The way the light played across the surface of the clay that Koi was beginning to shape. He noticed that Koi was not worried about the final outcome of the piece. He was not looking for perfection. He was simply present with the clay, working with it as if it were a partner rather than an object to be conquered. The apprentice noticed the fingerprint Koi left on the side of the pot, a small, subtle impression that had not been smoothed away, and he realized that it did not make the pot less beautiful. It made it human. This recognition did not immediately fix the apprentice's heart. He was still full of his own fear, and the memory of the broken bowl still stung like a fresh wound. But the pressure to be something else, something finished and untouchable, had begun to loosen. He had spent his time in the kiln of his own expectations, burning himself up to become a statue, while all along the earth was waiting to be held in a softer way. He did not know it yet, but the breaking of the bowl had not been a loss. It had been the first time he had truly allowed himself to be seen, not as a master of the craft, but as a person who was still, in every way that mattered, still being formed. There is a quiet, hidden strength in this realization. It is the realization that we are not the vases we are trying to create. We are the clay, and we are also the hand that touches it. When we allow ourselves to acknowledge the messiness, the breaks, and the fingerprints of our own lives, we are not failing. We are finally beginning to work in harmony with the truth of our own nature. The kiln may be hot, and the world may be hard, but the heart is made of earth that can always, at any moment, return to the center and begin again. The teaching, hidden inside the broken bowl, is not a lesson about pottery. It is a lesson about the exhausting way we treat our own grief, as though sorrow were a flaw in the material, rather than a natural mark of having lived and loved something real. We often believe that healing means becoming smooth again, that the goal of mourning is to arrive at some final, glazed version of ourselves where nothing wobbles and nothing shows. But this story is not telling us to stop feeling, and it is not asking us to become cold or unmoved by what we have lost. It is showing us something quieter underneath the surface, that our suffering rarely comes only from what actually broke. It comes from the frantic private effort to hide the break, to press the pieces back together in the dark so that no one, not even ourselves, will notice they were ever apart. Attachment, in the old teachings, is often misunderstood as simply caring too much about a person or a plan. But attachment is really the belief that we cannot be at peace until the shape of our life matches the shape we had already decided it should take. When the apprentice crushed his imperfect bowls back into shapeless lumps, he was not disciplining his craft. He was refusing to let anything exist that reminded him he was still becoming, still forming, still capable of a crack. Grief works on the heart in exactly the same way. We do not simply miss what is gone. We often punish ourselves for how visibly the missing shows, believing that a steady face and a dry eye are proof of strength, while a trembling voice or a sudden wave of sorrow in the middle of an ordinary afternoon is proof of some private failure. Buddhist wisdom offers a different measure of strength altogether. It suggests that impermanence is not a punishment handed down by an indifferent universe, but the basic material every living thing is made from. The same soft, unfired clay running through the mountain, the river, the year, and the human heart. Nothing that was ever shaped by love. Love was built to last in its original form forever. The bowl in your kitchen will someday chip. The person you loved will someday exist, mostly in memory. This is not the universe failing to protect you. It is the universe behaving exactly as it always has, the same slow given of change that shapes rivers into canyons and infants into elders. Suffering enters not through the fact of change itself, but through our furious insistence that this particular change should not have happened to us, that we alone should have been granted a version of love that never had to end. Notice, if it feels true, how much of your own exhaustion tonight is not the original loss at all, but the tightly wound effort to manage how that loss appears to others, to keep your voice level in the daytime, to answer the casual question of, how are you, with a small practiced lie, to schedule your sorrow into private hours so it does not inconvenience anyone else's morning. That management is heavy work, heavier in many ways than the grief itself, because grief simply asks to be felt, while the management asks you to perform an entire second labor of concealment on top of it. You are allowed to set that second labor down tonight, here in the dark, where no one is asking you to be smooth. Take a slow breath in and notice where your body has been holding its shape, the way the apprentice held his shoulders over the wheel. Tight, careful, bracing against the smallest wobble. Let your chest widen slightly as the air enters, and let your exhale carry some small portion of that bracing out of your frame. You do not have to hold a particular expression. Here, you do not have to keep your breathing quiet or your face arranged into calm. The room does not need convincing. The dark has already seen every uneven shape a person can take. and it has never once turned any of them away. If it feels right, let your attention settle on wherever the grief tends to gather in your body. Perhaps a tightness behind the sternum, a heaviness along the back of the throat, or a dull ache low in the stomach that never quite explains itself. You do not need to push this sensation away, and you do not need to analyze its exact shape or its exact cause. Simply notice it, the way Koi noticed the clay, leaning slightly to one side on the wheel, without alarm, without judgment, only the plain observation that here is where the material currently sits. Naming it gently to yourself, calling it the ache or the missing or simply the weight can be enough. You are not fixing it. You are only acknowledging that it is here, in the room, with you. Imagine now that the same lump of grey, cool clay from the workshop rests in your own two open hands. It is heavy in the particular way that wet earth is heavy, dense and cool and slightly resistant, holding the shape you last pressed into it without insisting on any shape of its own. Let whatever you are carrying tonight, the absence, the unfinished conversation, the version of the future you had quietly been expecting, settle into that clay the way water settles into low ground, without force, without a plan for what should happen next. You are not asking the clay to become a vessel. Yet, you are only allowing it to hold what you have been holding alone. Notice that the clay does not flinch from the weight. It does not judge the shape of your sorrow, and it does not ask you to justify why this particular loss still visits you at this particular hour. It simply receives what is given to it, patient in the old, unhurried way that only unfired earth can be patient, because it has nothing yet to protect and nothing yet to defend. If it feels right, let your hands soften around the shape they are holding. The same soft attention the potter gives the material before any wheel begins turning, listening rather than commanding, feeling rather than forcing. Let your breath continue its slow, steady rhythm. In and out, each cycle a small, private turning of the wheel that requires no effort from you, beyond your willingness to keep breathing. There is nothing you need to sculpt tonight. There is nowhere this clay needs to arrive by morning. You can simply hold what you are holding, in hands that have finally stopped bracing, in a body that has finally stopped performing its old, exhausting imitation of a finished glazed thing. In the same valley, some years after the winter, the apprentice first understood the meaning of the broken bowl. A woman named Sana arrived at the gate of Koji's workshop, carrying a cloth bundle against her chest as though it contained something still breathing. She had walked 3 days from a fishing village on the coast, where the sea had taken her husband the previous autumn, leaving her with a small house, a quiet child, and a single bowl he had eaten from every morning of their marriage. The bowl had cracked down its center the week after the funeral, dropped by an unsteady hand, at a moment when grief had made every surface feel slightly further away than it actually was. She had wrapped the two halves in cloth and carried them, unwilling to throw away the only object that still held the shape of his hands around it each morning. Koi received her at the low wooden bench near the kiln, his grey-dusted hands folding around the bundle with the same unhurried care he gave to any piece of raw clay. He did not ask her the story behind the crack, and he did not offer the soft, well-meaning words that so many others had already offered her in the months since the sea took him. He simply unwrapped the cloth, turned the two pieces over in the lantern light, and studied the clean, jagged line where the bowl had separated Sana watched his face for some sign of what he intended, bracing herself for the suggestion that the bowl was beyond saving, that some things, once broken, are simply gone. Instead, Koi reached into a low wooden box beside his bench and withdrew a small jar of thick, dark lacquer mixed with a fine golden dust that caught the firelight like scattered embers. He explained. In the plain, unadorned way he explained everything, that the crack would not be hidden. It would be filled, slowly and by hand, with this resin, bound in gold, so that when the bowl was whole again, the break would not disappear into invisibility. It would become the most visible part of the entire vessel, a bright, deliberate seam running through the center of the bowl like a small river of light. Sana felt something tighten in her chest at this suggestion. She had come, hoping the bowl could be returned to how it looked before. Whole and ordinary and unremarkable, so that each morning she could pretend for just a moment that nothing had changed. The idea of a golden scar running through the center of the one object that reminded her of him felt like an unbearable advertisement of her loss, a mark that anyone drinking from the bowl would notice and ask about. She told Koi this, her voice thin with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the 3 days of walking. She told him she did not want the crack to be beautiful. She wanted it to have never happened at all. Koi set the jar of lacquer down on the bench and looked at her with the same patient attention he gave to a piece of clay. Leaning slightly off-center, he told her that he had spent 40 years working with vessels that broke, and that in all that time he had never once successfully returned a cracked bowl to a version of itself that had never been cracked. Every attempt to hide a fracture completely, he said, weakens the bowl in a place no eye can see, because the glue beneath the disguised seam still remembers where the break occurred, and given enough time or enough heat or one more small fall from a shelf, it will separate again, exactly along the same invisible line. A hidden wound, he told her, does not heal, it only waits. Sana sat with this. For a long moment, the two halves of the bowl resting on the cloth between them, the kiln fire ticking softly in its brick housing. She asked him, her voice barely above the sound of the fire, how anyone was supposed to live with a mark like that, showing every single day, a permanent announcement to the world that something in her life had broken. Koi did not answer immediately. He picked up one half of the bowl and held it toward the firelight so that she could see the fine grain of the clay, the same grain her husband's hands had worn, smooth over years of ordinary mornings. He told her that the mark would not announce that something had broken. It would announce that something had been loved enough to be repaired. He began the work that evening, and Sana stayed to watch, unable to walk the 3 days home without seeing, at least once, how the bowl might look when it was finished. Koi worked with a patience that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time, applying the dark lacquer along the broken edge with a brush no wider than a single grass blade, pressing the two halves together and holding them with a quiet, unhurried pressure that asked nothing more of the material than that it simply rest in this new position. For a while, he explained, as he worked, that the gold dust was not decoration. It was structure, a way of making the repaired seam stronger than the surrounding clay, so that, if the bowl were ever dropped again, it would very likely crack somewhere new rather than along the old scar. The old wound, properly tended, became the strongest part of the entire vessel. Sana returned to the coastal village 3 days later, carrying the mended bowl wrapped in the same cloth, though she found herself unwrapping it more often on the walk home than she had expected, simply to look at the thin, golden line running through its center, catching whatever light was available, whether the pale morning sun or the last orange edge of the evening. When she placed it back on the shelf in her small kitchen, her child noticed it immediately, asking why the bowl now had a stripe of gold running through the middle, as if lightning had been captured and held still inside the clay. Sana found herself telling her child, in simple words meant for a small mind, that the bowl had broken once, and that, instead of throwing it away, or pretending it had never cracked, someone had mended it in a way that made the break part of its story. She said that the gold was there to show that some things become more precious after they are repaired, not less, because the repair itself is a kind of proof that someone cared enough to do the slow work of putting the pieces back together. She did not fully believe her own words as she spoke them. Not yet, but something in the saying of them settled slightly differently in her chest than it had before the 3-day walk to the mountain workshop. In the weeks that followed, each morning that she poured water into the mended bowl for her child, or set it out with rice for herself, she found her eyes drawn briefly to the golden seam, and instead of the sharp, private grief she expected, each time she found something closer to a quiet greeting, as though the bowl itself understood exactly what it had survived, and asked nothing further of her than that she keep using it. The crack had not disappeared, and her husband had not returned, but something in the daily ritual of eating from a visibly mended vessel had begun, slowly, to change the shape of the grief itself, from a wound she was constantly working to hide into a history she no longer needed to disguise. This quiet transformation is available to you as well, in whatever shape your own grief has taken tonight. The old teaching does not ask you to erase your sorrow, and it does not promise that the ache will vanish if you simply think about it correctly. It offers something more honest than that. It suggests that the visible seam of a loss, properly held rather than hidden, can become the strongest part of who you are, not because the breaking did not matter, but because it mattered enough to be mended with care, rather than concealed with shame. The first pain in this story was the crack itself, the sudden absence, the fall from the shelf that no one could have prevented. That pain belonged entirely to circumstance, to the plain fact of impermanence moving through an ordinary morning. The second pain, the pain that kept Sana awake with dread on her walk up the mountain, was the belief that the crack needed to be hidden completely, that any visible evidence of what had broken was itself a kind of failure. This second pain is almost always optional, though it rarely feels optional in the moment it arrives. It is the pain of believing that healed must mean unmarked, that moving forward must mean forgetting. That love which has lost its object must somehow disappear, rather than simply change its shape. You are not required to hide the golden seam running through your own life tonight. You are not required to explain it to anyone who does not ask with real care. You are only invited to notice that the seam is there, and that its presence does not diminish you. Consider how much energy you may have spent today, keeping your own crack hidden, choosing a careful tone of voice, changing the subject before a memory could surface, in front of someone else, arranging your face into an expression that suggested everything was fine. That management, that constant private effort to disguise the break, is a labor almost no one sees, and almost no one thanks you for. And it is often heavier than the grief itself, because grief simply asks to be felt in its own time, while the disguising asks you to perform a second, unpaid labor on top of the first. Tonight, in this dark and private room, you do not have to perform that labor. You can let the seam show. You can let it catch whatever small light is available, and you can let it simply be part of the shape you currently are. Bring your attention back to your own breath now, noticing that each inhale arrives without needing your permission, and each exhale leaves without needing your approval. This is the same unhurried, unforced rhythm that Koi brought to his mending. Patient, without urgency, trusting the process more than any single moment within it. Let your body settle a little further into the mattress with each slow release of air, feeling the places where old tension has been quietly, wordlessly held, perhaps behind the eyes, perhaps across the space between the shoulder blades, and let that tension soften by some small fraction, not because the grief has ended, but because you no longer need to brace against it in order to survive this particular hour. This same wisdom follows you into the ordinary hours of tomorrow. Long after this room has grown light again, you will move through an ordinary day filled with small, unremarkable moments that nonetheless brush against the shape of what you have lost. A song on the radio, an empty chair at a table, a habit of setting out 2 cups, before remembering there is only one person to drink from them now. In each of these moments, you do not need to perform the old, exhausting concealment. You do not need to force your face into a shape that reassures everyone around you that you are fully healed. You can let the small ache surface, breathe through it for the handful of seconds it usually takes to pass, and continue with your day, carrying your golden seam openly rather than hiding it beneath a smooth, practiced surface. You might notice, in the days ahead, a friend or a stranger who is carrying their own hidden crack, someone whose voice tightens slightly when a particular subject arises, someone whose smile seems to require a bit more effort than the moment calls for. You do not need to fix their grief, and you do not need to explain Koji's teaching to them in so many words. You can simply offer them the same patient attention the old potter offered every piece of clay that came to his bench, without alarm, without judgment, without the need to rush them toward a smoother, more convenient version of themselves. Sometimes the kindest thing available to us is simply to let another person's visible seam exist in our presence without flinching from it. Let this understanding settle now into the deep, unhurried quiet of the night. You do not have to solve your grief before you are allowed to rest, and you do not have to disguise it in order to be worthy of sleep. The golden seam running through your own history is not evidence of a failure. It is evidence that something in your life was loved enough to matter, loved enough that its ending left a mark, loved enough that the mark deserves to be tended rather than hidden. Let your shoulders drop, the last small measure of their old bracing. Let your jaw soften around whatever words you have not yet said tonight. Let your breath continue its long, unforced rhythm, moving in and out like the patient, unhurried motion of a hand that has finally stopped trying to hide what it is mending. Consider how this same golden seam might show itself tomorrow in the small, ordinary corners of your day that have nothing obviously to do with pottery or with the coastal village where Sana learned to live, beside her mended bowl. Perhaps you will sit in a meeting at work, half listening, while a colleague mentions an upcoming anniversary that quietly matches the date your own loss occurred. and you will feel the old tightening begin behind your ribs. You do not need to excuse yourself from the room in a panic, and you do not need to force your attention back to the agenda with a violent effort of will. You can simply notice the tightening, the way Koi noticed the clay leaning slightly to one side, without alarm, and let your next breath be a little slower than the one before it. The meeting will continue. The ache will pass through you the way weather passes through an open window, and you will still be sitting in your chair when it has gone. Perhaps you will open your phone during an ordinary afternoon and find, without warning, a photograph surfacing from a year ago, a face or a place that belongs to what you have lost, placed there by some indifferent piece of software that has no understanding of dates or grief. In the old way of managing your sorrow, you might have closed the screen quickly, swallowed the feeling whole, and carried on as though nothing had happened, adding one more small brick to the wall of concealment you have been building for months. Tonight's teaching offers a gentler option. You can let the photograph exist on the screen for a moment longer than feels comfortable. You can let your chest do whatever it needs to do. A catch of breath, a brief sting behind the eyes, and you can trust that this small, visible crack does not need to be hidden from the people around you, even if you choose, for practical reasons, to simply set the phone down and continue your day a few minutes later than planned. Perhaps you will sit at a family gathering where an empty chair or an unclaimed portion of food quietly marks the space where someone used to sit, and the people around the table will handle this absence in their own varied ways, some falling silent, some talking too quickly to cover the gap, some watching you carefully to see how you intend to respond. You do not owe any of them a particular performance. You do not have to laugh at the right moments to prove you are coping, and you do not have to excuse yourself to cry in a bathroom in order to protect their comfort from your grief. You are allowed to let your face show whatever it is actually feeling, the way the golden seam simply lies across the surface of the bowl, without apology, present, visible, and entirely a part of the gathering, rather than a disruption of it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from believing your grief has a schedule it must obey, that after a certain number of months you should be finished. Feeling this way, that a sudden wave of sorrow arriving at an inconvenient hour is somehow a sign that you have failed to heal correctly. Buddhist wisdom offers no such schedule. It suggests instead that healing is not a straight road leading away from the loss, but something closer to the slow work of the potter's hand, returning again and again to the same lump of clay, recentering it each time it leans, without frustration, without a fixed date by which the centering must be complete. Some days the clay will sit easily on the wheel. Other days it will wobble the moment you touch it. And both of these days belong equally to the same honest, ongoing process. If it feels right, let yourself notice how much kinder you have already learned to be toward other people's unfinished grief. How easily you can sit beside a friend whose sorrow arrives unpredictably, without demanding that they explain themselves or hurry toward composure. You are permitted to offer that same quality of patience to your own heart. You do not need to demand of yourself what you would never demand of someone you love. You do not need to rush your own recentering, simply because a calendar suggests that enough time has now passed. Let your body settle a little further into the mattress as this understanding moves through you, feeling the particular weight of your own thighs and hips sinking into whatever surface is supporting you. The same unhurried settling that clay finds when a potter finally lifts their hands away and lets the material simply exist without further shaping. Notice your shoulders and see if there is still a small residue of the old bracing held somewhere in that muscle, a readiness to perform composure the instant someone glances your way. You do not need that readiness here in the dark. No one is glancing your way tonight, except the quiet room itself, and the room has never once asked you to arrange your face into anything at all. Bring your attention to the backs of your knees, to the soft crease where your legs bend, and imagine that same golden lacquer koi used on Sana's bowl, tracing gently along every place in your body where old tension has settled, not to hide anything, but to mark those places as tended, as cared for, as worthy of attention rather than shame. Let your knees soften. Let your ankles loosen. Let your feet grow heavy against the sheets. Each part of you slowly joining the same unhurried stillness that the mended bowl finds each night on its simple wooden shelf, useful, whole, and entirely unconcerned with whether anyone notices the seam running through it. Take one more slow breath, feeling the air travel all the way down into the lower part of your belly before it turns and makes its quiet way back out into the room. With this exhale, let go of any remaining insistence that grief must look a certain way to be valid, that tears must arrive on schedule or not at all, that a full night's sleep somehow requires you to have already resolved every unfinished feeling from the day behind you. You have not failed by still feeling this. You have simply continued to love something that mattered enough to leave a mark. And that mark, however it shows itself tonight, whether as a tight throat, a heavy chest, or simply a quiet, wordless heaviness behind the eyes, is allowed to exist here without correction. The old teaching does not end with a single evening of understanding. It continues the way a river continues past whatever moment we happen to be watching it. Patient, unhurried, carrying small pieces of the mountain down toward the sea over years rather than hours. You do not need to complete your grief tonight, and you do not need to arrive at some polished, finished version of acceptance before you are allowed to close your eyes. You are simply invited to rest a little more honestly than you did last night, carrying your seam a little more openly, bracing against it a little less fiercely, trusting that the same patient hands which shaped the clay in the beginning are still, somehow, shaping you now, one slow, unhurried breath at a time. The workshop in the valley falls quiet as the kiln fire burns down to a low, steady ember, the same slow warmth it offers every night, regardless of what has broken or mended within its glow. Somewhere in that quiet, a bowl with a golden seam rests on a simple wooden shelf, holding its shape without apology, useful and whole, in a way that has nothing to do with looking as though it had never cracked at all. You can let your own body rest in that same unapologetic wholeness, now, heavy against the mattress, unhidden, unhurried, held by a darkness that has never once asked you to disguise what you carry. Feel the weight of your own limbs settling further into stillness, the same settling clay takes when it has finally stopped being worked and is simply allowed to rest before the next stage of its shaping. There is nothing left to smooth over tonight, and nothing left to press back into a shape that was never quite true. You are permitted to be exactly as marked, as mended, and as quietly whole as you are in this moment. without needing anyone's approval and without needing the morning to arrive with an explanation prepared. Let your breathing grow slower still, each exhale carrying a little more of the old bracing out of your chest, out of your throat, out of the small, tired muscles around your eyes. The golden seam will still be there tomorrow, catching whatever light the day happens to offer, and you will carry it the way Sana carries hers. Openly, without shame, useful and whole, in a way that has everything to do with having survived the break and nothing to do with pretending it never occurred. There is one more scene from the coastal village worth carrying with you into sleep tonight. Some months after, Koi mended the bowl. Sana returned once more to the mountain workshop. This time, without the cloth bundle, without any broken object needing repair at all. She had simply found herself walking the path again on a quiet morning when the weight in her chest felt heavier than the golden seam alone could hold. Koi did not seem surprised to see her arrive empty-handed. He gestured toward the low bench near the kiln, the same seat where she had once watched him work, by lantern light, and he continued his own quiet labor at the wheel, as though her presence required no explanation and no performance. She told him, after a long silence, that the bowl still sat on her shelf, exactly where she had placed it, and that most mornings she found comfort in its golden seam, but that some mornings, without warning, the same seam felt unbearable. A bright reminder rather than a comfort, and she did not understand why the meaning of the same object could shift so completely from one day to the next. Koi did not offer her a formula for controlling this shift, he told her. Instead, that the clay itself behaves this way, long before it ever becomes a bowl, soft and pliable in the morning dew, stiffening unpredictably by afternoon, depending on wind and warmth and 100 small conditions no potter can fully command. The material is never asked to hold one single mood forever. It is only asked to be worked with again, each day exactly as it happens to be found. This teaching may be the quiet permission you need tonight, that your own relationship to what you carry does not need to remain fixed in one shape. You are allowed to find comfort in your memories on one evening and to find them unbearably sharp on another, without either response being a failure of your healing. The heart, like the clay, responds to conditions that shift without warning and without any obligation to explain themselves. A certain slant of light through a window, an unexpected smell carried on the wind, a stranger's laugh that lands for half a second, exactly like a laugh you used to know. You do not need to master these shifts. You only need to keep returning to the wheel, breath after breath, the same unhurried return Koi brought to every lump of clay, regardless of how it had behaved the day before. Let yourself notice, one final time tonight, the quiet rhythm of your own chest, rising and falling beneath whatever blanket or stillness surrounds you now. This rhythm has continued faithfully through every difficult hour you have already survived, through every version of grief that has visited and shifted and returned again in some new and unexpected shape. It does not require your management, and it has never once asked you to arrive at a final, permanent understanding of your loss before it agrees to keep moving. It simply continues, patient and unhurried, the same steady turning of the wheel that carries you, without any effort of your own, from this breath into the next. If you notice your mind wanting to review the day one final time, searching for some mistake in how you handled a passing wave of sorrow, or measuring whether today's grief was better or worse managed than yesterday's. You can gently set that reviewing down, the way he set down his tools each evening, without needing to grade the work of the day. Before allowing himself to rest, there is no ledger being kept here. There is no score being tallied. There is only the clay, resting in whatever shape today happened to leave it in, ready to be met again, without judgment, whenever the next morning arrives. Feel your own weight sinking further into stillness now, your arms heavy at your sides, your legs releasing whatever last measure of readiness they had been holding on to, as though preparing to rise and manage some unfinished task. There is no task remaining tonight. The bowl rests on its shelf. The kiln has cooled to a low, steady ember. The valley outside the workshop has gone quiet beneath a sky too dark to reveal whether the clouds have cleared or gathered, and none of that uncertainty requires your attention before you are permitted to close your eyes. Let your breathing slow further still, each inhale a little softer than the one before it, each exhale releasing some small remaining thread of the day's careful performance. You do not have to hold your grief a particular way to be worthy of rest, and you do not have to resolve its shifting moods before morning. You are simply a person marked in places by love and by loss, resting in a dark room that has never once required you to look whole in order to be welcome within it. Let the golden seam, wherever it runs through your own history, simply exist tonight, catching whatever faint light the room still holds, asking nothing further of you than that you continue gently to breathe. Somewhere between the mountain workshop and your own quiet room tonight, the same patient wisdom is waiting to be practiced in whatever small moment presents itself tomorrow. You do not need a kiln, or a lump of grey clay, or a jar of golden lacquer to carry this teaching into your ordinary life. You only need the willingness. When a crack in your composure appears in the middle of an unremarkable afternoon, to let it be seen rather than hidden, to let it be tended rather than rushed, and to trust that the mending itself, however slow, however imperfect, is already a form of the peace you have been searching for. Let your hands, wherever they are, resting now, soften completely, the way Koji's hands softened once the day's work was finished and the tools had been set aside for the evening. There is nothing left in them to hold tonight. No bowl to mend, no crack to disguise, no performance to maintain for anyone who might be watching. They are simply hands resting at the end of a long day, exactly as tired and exactly as capable of rest as they have ever been. You are not the only one who has ever lain awake, wondering whether a particular kind of ache should have faded by now. Grief has never once respected the calendars we build for it. The quiet expectations that a year should be enough, that a certain birthday passing should mark some final threshold of healing, moves instead like weather over a long valley, sometimes distant and mild, sometimes gathering without warning, into something heavier than the day seemed to promise. You are not behind in your own healing simply because tonight feels heavier than last week. You are only living inside the honest, unhurried shape that grief actually takes, rather than the smooth, scheduled version the world sometimes expects of you. Let that honesty rest here, beside you now, unremarkable, unhidden, and entirely enough for one quiet night. Let this be enough understanding for tonight. Not a final answer, but a quiet companion to carry you into sleep. The clay does not need to become a finished vessel before the sun sets on it, and you do not need to complete your grief before you are permitted to rest. Tomorrow will bring its own conditions, its own light, its own unpredictable shifts, in what feels bearable and what feels heavy, and you will meet each of them the same way Koi met every lump of earth that arrived at his bench. Without judgment, without hurry, simply willing to begin again. And if the crack running through your own life was never a sign that you had failed to stay whole, but only proof of exactly how much you were willing to love something that could not, in the end, stay unbroken forever. Rest now, and let the slow, patient work of healing continue quietly on its own, without needing your permission to keep moving forward.